All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lawrence Brown, and today I will be moderating today's Book Buzz with the one and only Dr. Paul Vanderbroek, who is a historian, leadership and scholar, and executive coach with more than 15 years of HR senior leadership experience at multinational companies such as General Motors, Royal Dutch, and UBS Group AG. His work is a historical scholarship in practical leadership development. He is the author of several books, including Leadership Strategies for Women, and of course, Lead Like Julius Caesar, Timeless Leadership Lessons from History's Most Influential Leader. With that, I would like to go ahead and start with everyone. Please tell us where you're hailing from. We'd love to get some interactions here. It's designed to be conversational. But let's start with Paul. Tell me a little bit about your background with regard to why you chose to write this book.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much, LB, and hello everybody from Geneva, Switzerland. Happy to answer questions. So as you indeed just said about my bio, LB, over time in my career, I specialized in leadership development, and that's what I do now in different ways, in teaching, in executive coaching, as well as other leadership development programs. And in that line of work, I have seen that working with case studies of leaders and to be able to discuss those is a very effective way of helping leaders learn. I don't think there's any business school in the world which does not regularly teach through case studies, because it is an effective method. So that's why also I work with case studies. And as I'm an historian, I like to look back in history, and I think there's an advantage in looking back in history, because particularly if you go further back, like in the day of ancient Rome, you have a context which is comparable to ours, with, let's say, a free economy and certain laws which are akin to ours, but nevertheless, it's a much less complex context, and therefore it's more easy to see what works and what doesn't work, how things function, particularly with regard to leadership, which is often very difficult to find out in our current world, which has so much complexities. So that's a bit where I come from.
Awesome, thank you. And I appreciate that we had the opportunity to meet at ILA. And it's always an honor to meet authors. I think that's a lot of fun, and to be able to meet in person, I really appreciated that. I think that when we were chatting, you had talked about some of the core leadership lessons that you had learned over the process of writing the book. Can you tell us a little bit about a couple of those?
Yeah, I think that Caesar is, of course, by and large, a very successful leader, and that's also one of the reasons why I chose to study him. But because he was, on one hand, very successful, and on the other hand, not perfect, it's interesting also to look at the things which didn't go so well for him. And I think that the two things which stand out for me: on the one hand, he's an example of a powerful leader, and particularly when later in his career, when he was at the top, we think that such leaders are very independent in their decision making. And in Caesar's case, what I found out is that this less the case. He was very much influenced by his followers and pushed them to decisions which perhaps otherwise he may not have taken. And the second thing is that, yeah, we all know how Caesar's career dramatically ended. And actually, that final tragedy where he got assassinated was part of a pattern which pursued Caesar through his career, and which got him in difficulty several times, which he then managed to repair, but until the last time when he was not able to. And that is due to his emotional intelligence, which was not as developed as his other leadership skills, and particularly emotional intelligence with regard to larger groups, to sense what's going on under the surface with larger groups, and in his particular case, to sense certain dissatisfaction brewing, which then led to either to uprisings or at the end to an uprising against himself. So those are, I would say, two things which I found surprising and interesting when studying Caesar.
Okay, thank you. So from a contemporary standpoint, I know you do executive coaching, and you just talked about some of the traits of Caesar. How do you think that correlates to the work you do and leadership lessons for contemporary leaders?
Yeah, in Caesar's case, it's a case of a very successful leader again. which often is being perceived also nowadays as someone who perhaps does not need coaching because they are so good they can do it themselves. And in Caesar's case, who was not coached, as far as we know, coaching could have helped him to just discover these particular weaknesses, which could have just helped to turn the table in a positive direction in certain crucial moments of his career. And particularly the thing he was lacking was an effective feedback process, which could have helped him to just tweak his behavior in a positive direction. I think that there's, for me, a clear lesson there in this case study.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about, I'll extrapolate this, is that you were talking a little bit about the ego. And you see a lot of this impacting leaders, whether or not they're rising leaders, high potential. I know that you, again, had mentioned, we talked about being an executive coach, and it's a role that I also hold. I thought it was fascinating, some of the conversation that we had that I hope to pull out here is that the book helps you to look from a historical context. And as you mentioned, like case studies, they help you to avoid some of those traps. The other question that I had is that there are times where a leader has to make a bold decision, and sometimes that vision may be against the grain. How do you think that Caesar's life helps leaders to navigate those sorts of experiences?
Caesar was a person who was willing to take risks. And I think there's a lesson there, but he took risks from a position of strength. He knew that he was good in battle, for example, and in those situations, he was able to take risky decisions, which to turn the table and do things in a different way. So I think there is a lesson there to not just to take risks by themselves, but to take it from a position of strength, or perhaps more specifically, to take risks in a situation where you know that you are able to apply your strength in order to increase your chances of success. It's a different way of saying a calculated risks, but
Yes.
Calculated in the sense of what are the pros and cons or the risks and opportunity, a bit more in the sense of calculated. So what's the situation? What are my strengths? And to what extent can I apply them here and make that part of your risk assessment?
Thank you. For the component of what we're talking about, a little bit about risk, how do you think that we can learn from the balance that's required there, right? So there are times that you have to hold back, there are times that you have to move forward. And I think that a lot of times leaders are challenged in that way. When is it the right time to check the ego? What is the right time to silence everyone in your head and make that decision that sometimes may be even an unpopular decision?
No, in that respect, that's a learning process. It's not something you do just like that. And Caesar had to learn it over time. In his earlier career, he was much more inclined to take action in any situations, which sometimes also got him into trouble. Later on, he was able to, when this action approach, for example, during certain military campaigns, did not bring the result that wanted or even led to a defeat. He did learn from that, and you see that next time in situations he was less action oriented, but took more time to reflect and put himself again in a position of strength. So I think it's a learning process, but with Caesar is that, yeah, you learn it only if you put yourself in a situation that you can have the experience. And therefore, earlier in a career, to be more risk-taking, more action-oriented is probably a good idea. Also because there is less at stake. You may be less further in your career, and you can allow yourself to get it wrong sometimes, which is more difficult to do when you're later in your career and have a lot of responsibility.
Yes, as I looked at the book, that what was interesting is that we can always, I think what's interesting about books and from a historical context is that we can always be the criticism that's after the fact, right? But all the times as leaders, we're real time. And so I think when we can look back and say all these things that were done were, I would have done this, I would have done that day two conversation around, from a US perspective, we call it the armchair quarterback, right? The individual that can, I would have run this play, I would have done that differently, right? And so I think it's important, I think, to couch the idea of the historical context of what was happening at that time. To that point, when we think about a lot of the decisions that Caesar had to make in the great expanse of the Roman Empire, can you speak a little bit about his crisis leadership? Because you touched on that a little bit about sometimes the campaigns didn't necessarily go as anticipated. Just talk a little bit about how the crisis leadership in his style would show through.
So in earlier talked about his emotional intelligence, and there were, for example, apart from Montaigne, when he was assassinated, there were two examples where he was caught off guard because he didn't see it coming, again, by lack of emotional intelligence. And that one was when he thought the conquest of Gaul was all over, and then all of a sudden there was a huge uprising against the Romans. And something similar happened a little later during the Civil War. He thought the Civil War over, and then all of a sudden there was a huge uprising, this time in Spain. Both caught Caesar off guard, which was and both were a big crisis with a serious danger to put all the previous victories at risk. And yeah, in those situations, it helped that Caesar did several things. He stayed calm. And because he is a quick thinker, he was able to come up with solutions using, again, his strength of being very fast, also in moving troops around, in logistics, in innovative approaches to the military. And secondly, also, again, his risk-taking. He did join himself in those critical situations in the battle, sword in hand, putting his life at risk, but it had a significant impact on the motivation of his soldiers. And in those two examples, he carried the day and was able to overcome that difficult crisis.
When we think of leadership, at least from my perspective, when we think about the leaders that are top organizations, they may or may not have confidants. How do you think the fact of having someone that he could potentially confide in, how does that correlate, I think, to today, right? Where a lot of times, I think to your point, you touched on this already as far as having a coach.
Yeah.
So I think that you now have the event. I don't know if they had executive coaches back there. I'm going to take a big guess, and that was probably a no. How do
Well,
you, yeah.
you may be surprised, just to another question. Another known leader from that time is Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
And he did have a coach, a guy called Aristotle.
Oh, that's right. You're right.
Yeah. So it wouldn't have absolutely not have been impossible for Caesar to have a coach in that
Mm.
regard. And something he missed. And what worked reasonably well for Caesar is that he appreciated expertise. So one of his success factors that he surrounded himself with people who were very good at something. For example, at logistics, getting materials transported over great distances, finances and businessmen who were able to come up with money for his campaigns, lawyers who were able to make sure that his decisions and his laws were correct. And he cherished that, and he was good at picking those individuals. So to have this team of experts around him worked very well for him. But he did not go far to have a quote unquote leadership expert or a coach to help him in his decision making. Yeah.
Paul, thank you. We do have a question from the audience, which is a great segue. Please ask Mr. Vanderbroek which historical which yes, which historical figures, officials, associates, or family members influenced Caesar's leadership style?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There, I would first and foremost point to his mother. Caesar's mother was an influential woman who strongly pushed and motivated Caesar in his career. And women in politics only had an informal role. They were not allowed to be elected to office in Rome. In business, it was different. They could fully own businesses and did so very much. But in politics, it was informal. And his mother was nevertheless very influential as an effective networking. So he used the connections of her family and friends to be able to influence politics, and particularly also to help Caesar progress his career to get him in certain positions. And Caesar learned from her in that respect, that he became an important networking worker too. And people may have heard from the triumvirate, which was the first or the political coalition between the three leaders, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And I think that one of the things which worked for him very well. Then there were also anti-examples whom he learned from, in the sense of, I don't want to be like this person. So before Caesar, in Syria, there was a civil war, which was won by a guy called Sulla, who also became a dictator, very autocratic, and that was a very cruel person who killed a lot of and pursued a lot of adversaries. Because of that, when Sulla left, there was no real peace, but political conflicts started again, apart from all the drama to individuals. And Caesar said, whenever I'm in such a position, I don't want to be like this person. And that's what he was. No one knew that. Ultimately, absolute power. He did not apply the same cruelty and persecution as he had seen before.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point about leadership, is that sometimes it's important to learn what you absolutely would not do, right?
Yes.
So I think that's also a great point. You talked a little bit about the followers. Can you speak on the idea of his inclusive leadership style?
Yeah, so that was a key success factor for Caesar. Roman Republic was a stratified society, which means that people with a higher social status had more chances of attaining executive office and have a career in the government or in the military for that matter. And Caesar, on the contrary, consciously recruited talented individuals from a quote unquote lower social background to include them in his organization as military officers and also in a political organization. And because of that, he became a talent magnet for those talented and individual and ambitious individuals. And he could have access to people others left aside. And it became a major factor in his success, whether it's in politics, in government, but also notably as a general with a talented and effective officer corps at his disposal.
You talked a little bit about Caesar's demise. What are some of the lessons that I think that we can learn from, in terms of the balance of power versus that followership, versus being able to, I oftentimes describe leadership as being able to, sometimes we tend to be very myopic, versus being able to, as a plane flies across the radar, and kind of identify these different things. And there's a lot of complexity in that. Can you speak to that, as far as, I guess, modern day leadership as a lesson learned from what happened to Caesar ultimately?
Caesar had a plan and a vision, which in itself was good, to make sure that after Civil War there would be peace, and that problems that led to the Civil War would be resolved in the economy or in the political structure. And he was pushing a big plan to do that. The point is, with his style, very action-oriented, very quick, he pushed that forward without necessarily assuring an adequate buy-in. And I think that's where a learning is. Caesar did not really realize that once he got to the top, he needed to change his style: less action, more communication, more finding out what people want and need, explaining a lot of why and how he did it. And he wasn't a bit in a rush. And the things he did well in the past, for example, writing about his conquest of Gaul, which we can still read today, and which was an excellent way of telling people back home what he was doing and why he was doing and so forth. That sort of he forgot later on in his career and didn't find the time to do that, unfortunately.
I think the audience is tracking with you, Paul, because this question, I think, is another great segue. It is, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, was it from a psychological decision or political necessity, or both?
Let me put it differently. It was a result of an escalation of increasing political conflict, and the decision to ultimately cross had to do with several factors. On the one hand, it was Caesar felt committed to his followers who depended on him for their career and so forth. And the information Caesar received about his adversaries and the negotiations that were going on to escalate were all filtered through his followers. He used intermediaries to do that for him. And these followers were very dependent on Caesar staying in power. So they pushed for a decision that would let Caesar stay in power, and which ultimately became crossing the Rubicon and moving into a civil war. And if Caesar would have, as well as his adversary, would have taken the opportunity to talk face to face, then perhaps I would have had an opportunity for de-escalation. So it's a combination of things, but the most interesting findings, if I can put it in that way, was this role of the followers in pushing Caesar across the Rubicon, and it turning out to be much less of an independent decision by one man to take this fateful step.
Awesome. So I don't want to dominate, but I do have a couple more questions, and I know we're running up on time. But for the audience, if you have any questions, please continue to send those in, and I will defer my questions for your questions. Please feel free to continue to do. As far as, I guess this is more of a fun question. If Caesar were here today, what company do you think he would run, and how do you think he would run it?
I think it would be a high-tech company. He was, in many respects, whatever he did in politics and government and military, he was an innovator. He liked change. He pushed for change. He liked things to go fast. And I think that type of environment would suit him very well. And he would also lead that in a way, pushing his organization of people towards that, on one hand, excellence, on the one hand, also to do things new and differently.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of correlation to the volatility and the pace and change in
Yes.
tech that would be extremely fascinating. And I think there's a correlation to your point about those are big decisions that individuals are having to make in fairly quick order, and that it could take them one direction or the other really, really quickly. So I would agree with that. My last question is that what do you think is the lasting legacy and just a general reflection on Caesar, for which you have a lot of passion about? Again, when you and I met, your eyes lit up as we were talking about this subject, just about leadership in general, your executive coaching, your connection with leading, in the space of having gender equity for women as well. So what would be your thoughts on the lasting legacy and the reflection of Caesar?
I think the example of Caesar shows that leadership is developed over time. It takes a career to do it. It's also a very complex profession, if I can call it in that way. And at the same time, it's also, it takes talent to get there, but it can also be learned. And most importantly, perhaps, there is a case of that, if leadership is something, or being a leader, if you want to put it in a more formal sense, is something you need to want to do. There's something you need to enjoy, to have responsibility over others, over things, and to bring things forward. So there is an innate motivation of taking up such a role to actually be able to do it.
All right. We do have one more question from the audience, so I will share it now. Very interesting perspective on the political impetus to which he had to respond, as well as serve and influence. Those of us interested in what influences major political shifts, should we focus more on these dynamics and movements beyond the leader and not quite followership? And the second part of it is Project 2025 an analogy for the groups around Julius Caesar?
With regard to the first question, I think, yes, it's important to look beyond the leader in the sense of what are the trends that are going on, which allow a leader to take action or not. It's not a one-person thing. It's very much influenced by the context and the people around the leader. So it's absolutely important to take that into account. With regard to Project 2025, I don't see quite the analogy with Caesar. Caesar was somebody who wanted to bring his organization forward. He was a reformer, innovative, but he was not a revolutionary, was not in his mind. He went fast, and as we discussed earlier with regard to buy-in, too fast for his stakeholders, and that's why some of them thought he was bringing about a revolution. But it was not his intention. So I think in that respect, I don't see quite a connection between those two projects for changing a state and organization.
Okay, thank you. And I do have one last question, or maybe a statement, and then we'll let you close out. But just for everybody that is aware, there are links that are showing where you can secure Paul's book, which I do think is very fascinating. One of the things that you just mentioned that about Caesar would probably be a tech leader, is the pace at which we have information at our fingertips. It's really fascinating how that would not have been the case in Caesar's time, and how much more challenging leadership decisions are when you don't necessarily have access to that information at your fingertips. Again, just I think another great perspective. And any last words that you'd like to share with us before we part ways?
Yeah, so I think it's important that when I talk about history and individuals from history, I consciously talk about examples or case studies. I never consider these individuals a role model. And they should be looked upon in that way. It's an opportunity, as I say, for those who are leaders themselves, or those who work with leaders as a development professional. It's an opportunity to benchmark this individual, this case study, with either your own career or your client's career, and to gain different perspectives, another way of looking at it, and from there to be able to perhaps translate what you see there in your own practice. And I think that's an important perspective to bear in mind, that we're talking about examples here and not about role models.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that is an excellent closing point. And we thank you for your time today. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. Please remember to go out and purchase the book and find out even more fascinating things about Julius Caesar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, LB. It was wonderful to be with you here today.
Awesome. Take care.